Hi, welcome to Futurology. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, the president of the Berggruen Institute. In this episode, we have senior advisor Nils Gilman in discussion with celebrated author Ken Liu. Ken Liu has not had a straightforward career. He started out writing code, then law, and then fiction. Ken is a celebrated author of many works, including a short story, The Paper Menagerie, and a series, The Dandelion Dynasty. He's also the translator of works such as The Tao Te Ching and The Three-Body Problem. And both storytelling and translation have really shaped Ken's thinking. Ken sees storytelling as a social technology, one that helps us coordinate, one that helps us develop shared futures. And translation is more than just words and language. It is the way we interpret the world across cultures, across worldviews, and across species. In this interview, Nils and Ken discuss storytelling, they discuss translation, and they discuss how AI is not just a technology for translation, but one with which we will co-create and maybe an art form itself. And now, Nils Gilman and Ken Liu on Futurology.
Ken Liu, welcome to the Futurology podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start at the beginning. You have a kind of interesting background. Tell us a little bit about your childhood and how that has come to inform some of your work and thinking over the years.
Yeah, this is one of those interesting questions, which is, to what extent should we talk about people's work as part of their biography or not? This is actually one of the central questions we should struggle with. So I think the default position in contemporary society is your biography is almost determinative of your work in a way that I think some of the older traditions may find odd, right? So if you study the critical tradition, one of the interesting moves we've made is rather than the death of the author, we've now sort of turned art criticism into the biography of the author. I say all of that as a preface to sort of say that I think it's interesting to think about how people tell their own stories and to what extent they think those stories matter or not. So to me, here's something that's interesting, right? So I was born in China, but I grew up in the US, and I consider myself an American. And yet one of the persistent, strange phenomena I encounter is this persistent refusal to interpret my work on its own merits, but to sort of ground it in this biographical tradition and sort of think, because the person was born in a certain way, their positions must necessarily be interpreted through those lens. So I think that's one of those things that I sort of work with and think about a lot. A lot of my work is actually focused on this idea of why do we think that we cannot interpret a work unless we understand it through the lens of the creator? Is that necessarily a good thing, a bad thing? Is that something inevitable as long as we're human beings? Now, as far as my own journey to get to this particular time and place, I've had what I would describe as not a very considered or thought out career path, which I think you're familiar with. So I started out as an English major, but I studied computer science in college. And so right after college, I became a technologist, a programmer, and I did a startup. That was all wonderful. But then I switched over to the practice of law. I was a corporate lawyer for a number of years. And then I became a litigation consultant, which basically meant that I was a kind of a historian of technology, trying to explain technology to courts and juries. But during all that time, I was also writing and publishing fiction. And after something like 20 years of publishing consistently while I was doing all these other jobs, I went full-time as a writer. So that's what I do now. I'm a technologist, a writer, and I make up stories for a living. That's essentially what I do.
One of the things I think is really interesting about your work is these three streams, if you will, the lawyerly, the technologist, and the creative writer have all intersected and flowed together in various formulations over time. And I think that is a pretty unusual combination. I think one of the things that makes your work original is that particular set of things combined then with another element, which is this question of cross-cultural dialogue, interface, confusion is like another abiding kind of theme of your work. And so we'll get into all of that today. Another thing that you didn't mention that you've done a lot of is translation work, which I think of as actually an interesting kind of combination of all of those things in itself, right? Translation, and we'll talk about AI as a kind of fundamentally a translation tool. But translation is also a process of trying to understand and have fidelity in a legal sense to the original, but it's also more than that. It's also an act of interpretation. There's no act of translation that's not an act of interpretation at the same time.
Right.
And I thought maybe I would mention one of my favorite articles is by Vladimir Nabokov. He proposes a theoretical dictionary of words that don't exist. He doesn't actually name the words, but he just proposes definitions for things that there ought to be words for. And one of his words that there doesn't exist a word for that there ought to be is using the act of translation to improve the original text. And so I was wondering if you might reflect a little bit about how, when you think about translation, both literally translation from one text to one language to another language, but in general, the process of interpretation through translation, how you think about that as an act of creation through translation.
So the way I want to sort of approach this question is to ask people to think about what they think translation means, right? So I think AI has actually been extremely helpful in that it has taught people a particularly limited version of what translation means. So what something like Google Translate or ChatGPT is particularly good at, right, in its default state, is translation in the very narrow sense of conveying a message from one language to another. The very narrow example would be giving directions, right? So you give directions in Italian and you translate that into English. A good translation would get you, an English speaker, to where you wanted to go. A bad translation would not. So in that very narrow sense of translation, I think that's how a lot of people think of it. They think that linguistic utterances have a message and the message should be conveyed over. That form of translation can be handled very well by AI. And it's the kind of translation that is of zero interest to most of us. It's just not. The ability to convey a message is, in fact, just one particular use of language. And it's usually the version of translation in which very little creativity exists and isn't particularly artistically interesting. What is interesting in the Nabokovian sense and the sense that we're talking about is the kind of translation where the linguistic utterances have multiplicity of meanings, right? And the translation is an attempt to sort of figure out which meanings can be best conveyed or reconstructed or excavated, however you wish, in the new particular linguistic context. So an example of this, I'll use an example for people to think about, and I think this is actually very instructive. So suppose you're talking with someone and they try to explain something to you. They tell you their life story, okay? And then you're asked immediately afterwards to retell that story. Now, for most of us, when they retell that story, it will not be the same as the one that the first person told. So what you've just done is actually a translation of that story into your own context, your own narrative context. And what is fascinating to me is people don't think of this translation, but in fact, that is what is happening constantly. In fact, all conversations are translation. Somebody says something, prompting the other person to say something back that is essentially a rephrasing or sometimes a modification of the original in some sense. But it's basically a way to say, I understand you. This is what you said, and I am going to repeat it back to you in some sense, right? It turns out that translations occur in all kinds of contexts in which we don't think of it as translation. Translation is essentially a matter of rephrasing. In fact, I would argue all creative acts are rephrasings, right? So dictionaries are translations. They take one word and they give you a definition, which is a translation of the definition. And yet you can see that the definitions are not exactly the same as the translation, right? You have a word and you have 5 definitions, each of which is a translation. And yet each of them is also not an exact same repetition of the original utterance, right? And all linguistic performances have this nature to it. This is actually why, it's fascinating to sort of think back to large language models. Our current large language models are constructed using what's called the transformer as an architecture. And if you read the original paper for the transformer, it was proposed as a way to solve the translation problem, to solve the problem of how do you translate utterances from one language to another in such a way that you are able to accurately have the context to understand all the references and all the pronouns and all the connections between different parts of the sentence, such that you can pull it out. Because older translation models tended to use a probabilistic model that's based on a moving window. And the transformer's great innovation is that now you can pay attention to all parts of the original, such that you no longer are limited in that way. And just it's sort of amazing to think that this architecture originally proposed to solve the problem of translation ended up solving so many other problems in large language models, because fundamentally all linguistic performance is translation. You are constantly rephrasing utterances into your new context, and then other people translate that and reflect it back to you. This is in fact how we convey our inner states, our consciousnesses to each other. So all linguistic utterances are translations in the broad sense, and all meaning making, therefore, is translation in that broad philosophical sense.
That's great. And I want to talk about one of your most celebrated stories, The Paper Menagerie, which is centrally about many of the things you were just discussing. So for people who haven't read the story, and I recommend the story, it's one of the best short stories I read in the last, that's been published this century, I would say. And no spoilers here, but it's a story about a bicultural little boy and his memory and his relationship with his bicultural parents, or his parents from two different cultures. In the story, the child has a Chinese mother and a white American father.
That's right.
And he's trying in this story to come to terms with the different languages that he's using with his parents, and he struggles around moving from one language to another. So let me just ask, as a personal matter, did you become interested in this sense of translation in the general sense you're talking about now already as a child, because you were, growing up speaking Chinese and then coming to America and starting to speak English and reading English? And obviously there must have been processes every day of you moving between two different languages. Is that really where you started to become interested in translation as a general, like a general problem, not as a specific lexical problem?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for you, because one of the things that we do as humans is we constantly narrate our own lives, right? We sort of confabulate the story about who we are and how we get to be where we are. And I've learned over time as a lawyer, right? You're very naturally very skeptical about this sort of thing. And what I've found is that the way that humans retell their own stories and how they come to important positions are often true in the deep sense, but often confabulated in the shallow sense. In other words, there is some sense in which these stories reveal deep commitments, but the factual details are often actually confabulated and not quite accurate. All that is to say that I do recall myself being particularly interested in the way that translation was not how I understood it. So I think most people who remember, so if you weren't, if you didn't literally grow up speaking multiple languages, I think this is true. If you are monolingual at some point in your life, right? If you were monolingual at some point in your life, then at some point you probably had this concept that translation is a matter of one-to-one correspondences in the narrow sense that I meant above. So that is, people who are not speaking, say, English are just saying the same things, literally the same things, just using different sounds. And if you just figure out how these sounds correspond to each other, you would basically know that other language. One of the things you obviously learn as you actually study other languages is that's not how that works out. In fact, languages partition the world experience into very different spaces. And there is sometimes a topological mapping between them. That's in fact how AI can do what they do. They find these correspondences, but the details are not, right? So the analogy I use is that two languages are like two trees. They are roughly the same shape, and they sometimes have large branches that map even in a similar way so that you can sort of map them to each other. But the details are not the same. You will find little twigs in one tree that have no exact correspondence in the other. So there's like an absence there, where Nabokov says there ought to be words that exist for this, but they don't. And so I can sort of remember moments where I found that interesting. But in terms of this general sort of idea that all sort of communication and all meaning making is in some sense this form of rephrasing, restatement, tautological expansion of what is already there. That I don't think I had a very clear articulation of until much later, perhaps after I became a lawyer, I would think, because the law is also entirely based on this concept of interpretation and translation. I mean, this is why we can have entire legal theories fighting over what exactly the Second Amendment means, right? If all translation is just a simple matter of looking at meanings in a dictionary and say you're done, we wouldn't be having these arguments.
Right. I grew up bilingual, speaking Danish with my mother and English with my father. And there were other languages in my family, French and Spanish, that were around. But I grew up really bilingual with the two languages in my household. So I never was monolingual. I was always bilingual.
Right.
My younger brother, also grew up obviously in the same family, the same environment. But I'm told that my brother and I reacted really differently from growing up in these two different, with this double language household. I didn't speak at all until I was 18 months. Actually, my parents were a little worried that I might have a language problem. I've been kind of making up for it ever since.
Right.
But when I did start to speak, I actually differentiated the two languages, and I spoke Danish with my mother and English with my father. And I understood on some level, obviously not in a theoretical sense, but I understood there were sort of two linguistic worlds happening here, and that I could speak English with one half of it and Danish with the other half. My brother actually did the opposite. He started basically creating a pidgin, and he started speaking when he was a year old, like at a more normal cycle age, and then just started mixing the languages and actually mixing them both at the grammatical level and at the lexical level. In your writing, have you thought about that? About like how do you create like new kinds of linguistic forms out of mixing languages that way?
I think that's actually what all writers do fundamentally. Again, let's think about what languages actually mean. A lot of the definitions about what languages are really political decisions. They're not, naturalistic or observational. But I would argue that, in terms of actual languages, right, there are these grapholects, large transnational grapholects that we often are committed to. So meaning these are languages that revere and hold writing as the standard, right? So English is an example of a grapholect in which we sort of revere the most proper form. We treat formal writing as that model. But in practice, right, we speak very different versions of English, like the many, many, many different varieties of English you would find in the United Kingdom, right? Or the many, many different varieties of English you would find in America, depending on what linguistic group you're talking to. They can be at the level of large regions, states, cities, and in the UK, right, counties, even villages may have their own particular...
And subcultures.
Absolutely. But they go down to the level even of... families and individuals, right? So even individuals speak an idiolect. I would argue that writers who are worth reading are writers who craft their own language. That's what they spend much of their artistic energy into, right? Inventing that unique language of theirs. So this is why, Jane Austen writes in a very different way than everybody else around her time. It's not like she wrote, some sort of early 19th century English. She wrote a very specific idiolect that she invented. How did she do that? She obviously observed all the languages and all the idiolects around her. And then she decided to take them and then modify them and add her own innovations. I would argue that, in fact, all writers do that. And that may be one of the ways in which human writing is at present different from AI writing, precisely because human writing has at its heart this deep desire to craft your own language. At least writers who are interested in being considered artistic do so, whereas AI is fundamentally pushing against that idea of innovating at that level.
So I want to get into a little bit more about your craft, because I think one of the things that's interesting, even about the biography that you've just laid out, learning how to be an English major, but also write code and then write legal writing, and then writing fiction and creative writing on the side. I actually spent a year after college working as a paralegal in a law firm.
Oh God!
And I learned how to do legal writing, and it was a real eye-opening experience.
Yes.
And in some ways, it was really helpful. I mean, I got one of the best pieces of writing advice I ever got was from one of the lawyers I was writing for. She looked at that first draft I'd produced of some brief, and she said, "What do you think you are, F. Scott Fitzgerald? Say it once, say it right, don't say it again." Right? And legal writing, to your point, there's a very strict kind of formalism to it. Not to say that people celebrate Antonin Scalia's writing from the bench, but okay, if you're a Supreme Court justice, maybe you get to do some rhetorical flourishes, but mostly, particularly if you're a lawyer writing a brief, you're supposed to write in a very particular kind of way. That's not meant really to express a personal flair. It's meant to express a kind of, maybe perform a certain kind of objectivity in discourse. Whereas creative writing, to your point, is meant to express a unique voice. And so I'm wondering how you thought about the difference. And then if we talk about code, of course, there's literally rules. If you don't write the code in a certain way, it's not going to actually perform and do the things you want it to do. So when you think about the three different ways, code, legal writing, and creative writing, about what the relationship is between those for you?
Well, the way I think about it is that these are very different symbolic manipulations, right? You're constructing symbolic structures in all of these cases, but they serve very different purposes. So in legal writing, to your point, right, what happens in legal writing is that it's a very specific use of language intended to narrow the field of possibilities, to narrow interpretation as much as possible. So when you write a contract, you have to eliminate all ambiguities. When you're writing a brief, you have to persuade the judge that there's actually no other way to decide this issue other than the one you're presenting, right? So you're narrowing the field of possibilities, and you have to sort of box the reader into a particular interpretation. That's the purported goal, right? Once you've actually been studying legal theory and practicing law for a while, you realize that that's actually not true at all. There's a much deeper acceptance and sort of agreement by all parties to preserve a certain level of ambiguity. Contracts are actually never perfectly specified. There's always a huge amount of ambiguity left in there strategically because the parties have agreed to allocate the risk in such a way that they're willing to bear the risk when things go against them. So when those things show up, it's not because the drafter failed. It's because the parties could not agree on something, and they have agreed to disagree, if you will, by preserving.
And you see that all the time, for example, in treaties.
Yes.
Right, which is a form of legal writing.
Right, or legislation. Oftentimes, the reason legislation is the way they are is because they represent compromises among all parties, unwilling to specify it any further. And they're all willing to leave it unsaid. They are, in fact, trying to say with legal doctrine what cannot be said in legal doctrine, if you will, right?
Yeah.
So when you're writing code, it's a very different kind of performance. Now, we can all debate over whether computer languages are in fact languages in the way humans mean it at all. I think it's an interesting question. I would not say that computer languages are languages at all. They're mathematical formalisms, really. And math is one of those things that is very interesting because, you can ask the question of, is math discovered or is it actually invented, right? Does math actually represent some deep pattern of nature, or is it something that humans have invented to structure reality in some way? But regardless, math is unique and different from human language in the sense that when you utter a linguistic utterance to another human being, the other human being will interpret what you say. And as I've explained multiple times, in all kinds of linguistic contexts, ambiguity and a multiplicity of meanings are the point. But math is not like that. Math is one of the few human mental inventions in which an idea that I have in my head can be conveyed exactly to you without alteration, which is incredible if you're used to language. Language is so malleable and changeable and impossible to pin down, whereas math is not. It's the very opposite. And computer languages are much more like mathematical formalisms than, linguistic performance.
Right. And higher level programming languages use more language that's more like normal human speech.
A little more, but they are still fundamentally, they do what they do because they can be translated at the bottom down to that thing, to very precise mathematical.
Right. Although now we're getting to a point with LLMs where people are going to be able to do prompt engineering,
Yes.
right, which is in normal, not just necessarily English, but normal human language, and then the machine will translate it down to math, supposedly for you.
That's why LLMs are really fascinating. If you had asked me 20 years ago whether LLMs are possible in the sense of you can describe what you want in a program and have the computer generate it for you, I would have said no, because reducing or translating human ideas, these vague ideas about what you want to do, into precise mathematical formalism is something that I thought at one point the very definition of human intelligence, right? But today obviously LLMs are very good at that. So that is interesting. So then finally, going back to the third type of language use that we were talking about, which is creative writing. That is, as I said, very different. It's not an attempt to narrow the field of interpretability. It's really to sort of widen the field of interpretability. If anything, you're trying to use language in a way to evoke things and to represent and to bring forth interpretations that have not existed before. That really is the whole point of art. And so I'm sort of paraphrasing Ursula K. Le Guin here, but basically she says something to the effect of, artists who work with words are trying to say with words what cannot be said in words, right? That is the essence of linguistic art, of fiction, of poetry, of all of that. And that requires using language in such a way that you're sort of breaking past the cliches, right? So a lot of linguistic communication is possible precisely because we have agreed on a set of cliches that we're going to constantly use to represent certain concepts. And creative writing often is about either breaking away from those cliches to get you to think about something entirely different, or to use the cliches in such a way that they generate new meaning, new possibilities that were not inherent in them before.
So I want to get back to the paper menagerie, because I think there's another element of difference between coding and legal writing and creative writing, which is the role of feeling and the induction of feeling in the recipient of the language.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some people who are trying to make the computer feel something when they're writing code, but I don't think that happens too much. Sometimes there's an effort in legal writing to invoke a kind of emotional reaction.
Yeah, but I would say often, actually.
Right. But but usually it's trying to get people to emotionally react to something that there's being described in the external world. Whereas a great deal of creative writing is not trying to make you have an emotional reaction to a referent in the outside world, but is making you react to the characters and to even the language itself on an emotional level. I don't think I'm at all unique in that I had a very emotional reaction to the paper menagerie. I don't want to give any spoilers to it. It's not a very long story, so you can get to the emotional heart of it pretty quickly. But I had a very emotional reaction to it. I actually talked to my kids about it. They all went to a Mandarin immersion school, and this was assigned for all of them in 8th grade, I think, when they were finishing up their primary education, because it's a great story about the challenges. The emotion is about the challenges that the narrator, the young boy, and then later grown up, feels with relation to his bicultural background. And I thought, one of the real powers of that story to me, Ken, is the way in which you do it in very plain language. You don't play any sort of tricky linguistic Nabokovian games, I would say, in order to evoke that. Tell us a little bit about your process. This is obviously something you did intentionally as a writer. Your process for thinking about how you want to generate feeling in your reader.
Right. So the way I think about it is emotions are often, I would argue, the root of our moral commitments. We make a lot of decisions morally to choose one or the other, often based on an emotional feeling about one choice versus another. And our moral intuition is based on this sort of emotional core. So that's why these emotions do get encoded in the law. When I try to write fiction, though, I have to sort of think about how fiction serves the exact opposite purposes. It's not about abstracting emotions away. It's about actually making emotions concrete. to allow the reader to have new sensations, to have a new perspective, to have new understanding about the human experience that they didn't have before. Reading fiction is basically an exercise in empathy, right? It's an exercise in role-playing, in trying to to experience another consciousness. So when I was writing something like The Paper Menagerie, I have to sort of use a very specific voice or style. It's a matter of craft. What I'm really trying to do is to make what is otherwise very difficult look simple, right? So what appears to be very simple or something that feels almost effortless is often incredibly difficult, because it's very easy to use a lot of words to add a lot of noise to something, but it's very hard to strip away all of that stuff until you're left with something very simple, which is why, something like Hemingway gets parodied a lot, but it's actually incredibly difficult to do Hemingway well.
Right.
Because the kind of, Hemingway does where he uses these very supposedly simple sentences, but there's actually a very deep prosody and rhythm to them. So when you read something like The Old Man and the Sea, so much of what is said is not said. Right. And so that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to see if there's a way for me to create my own version of a style which uses very spare and simple constructions to convey the kind of feeling that is just too much for words.
In this context, since you bring up Hemingway, I'll bring up one of my favorite stories of his, which is this famous 6-word story that people know, right? Which is for sale, baby shoes, never worn, right? And even you just think about the language he uses there. It's not never used, it's never worn, right? And he's therefore invoking, I mean, it's obvious what he's doing there, but it's 6 words. He manages to tell a whole story that has an emotional substrate to it that provokes in the reader. Let me talk more about Paper Menagerie and pivot to your other fictional writing. One of the things I find interesting about the fact that, I mean, I understand why Paper Menagerie won all the awards it did and totally deserving of that, but it's a little bit of an unusual story in your overall oeuvre, because it's not a speculative fiction, really. It has some magical realist elements and some fantastical elements in the beginning, particularly in evoking the imagination of the protagonist. But it's not a speculative fiction. It's not rooted in some technological speculation or some alternative technological world. And a lot of the writing you've done is more in that vein. And I guess one question I have for you is, when you think about why you want to take on speculative fictions, particularly ones that take on technology, which is what a lot of your technological possibilities in the future, it also is emotional that you're trying to evoke. And so what is the relationship between the speculative aspects of your writing, which are analytic on some level, right, and the effort to, from a writerly perspective, create narratives that have feeling in them?
The way I would think about it is, I do hear, this theory of science fiction, which is very much about, predicting the future and sort of figuring out what we can do to build the future that we want. I'm not all that enamored of that school of thinking about sci-fi. I don't think that's what I do, and I'm not particularly drawn to it. I, again, sort of think about fiction writing, speculative fiction, magic realism, fantasy, what have you, as basically essentially variations of the same thing, which is the stories or art in general is not really about the external world. I mean, they obviously, we will use elements of the external world in the story, but they're not about that. Fiction really is about the inner world, what is inside of us. It's about dreams, to put it simply, right? So Berggruen, again, is somebody who I think a lot about in terms of her theories of fiction. And she basically said something to the effect of, artists don't find stories out there. We're not cameras. We're not there to reflect reality in some way. We journey to the country of the collective unconscious, and we find there deep mythological creatures, gods, dreams, what have you, and we bring them back out to the mundane world. And then we have to figure out how to convey those things that we found in the collective unconscious. And sometimes we do it through fantasy. We talk about dragons and we talk about things like that. And sometimes we do it through the newest province of the ancient empire of fantasy, which is science fiction, mainly because technology has now taken on a mythological role in our lives. That's why science fiction uses the symbols of science and technology, basically, to convey ideas about the inner world. So a good example of this would be something like Frankenstein, right? So the creature, right, is one of those wonderful things that Mary Shelley excavated from the collective unconscious and brought forth and gave it a name. And now the creature is something that we evoke every single time we talk about new technology. It's become a minor god, sometimes perhaps even a major god at the level of Apollo or Mercury, right? In the same way that Ovid used the Roman gods to really talk about what it's like to be alive, in his time. We now use something like the creature to express our anxieties about technology and our fears about what the future holds. I think that's what I do with my work. I mean, I don't know if I can ever create something as grand as the creature, like Mary Shelley, but I've created minor things that are like that. And I would say that, whether I'm writing in the magic realism mode or a fantasy or a sci-fi, what I'm ultimately doing is the same, which is to excavate in the collective unconscious these symbols, these deep mythological manifestations, and then I try to talk about them in this world using symbols that are technological, mythological, or fantastical, what have you. But ultimately, it's about that inner sense of, in our collective unconscious, of what it means to be human. How do we connect with the universe? How do we find meaning, right? The paper menagerie is one of them. And my sci-fi speculative work represents another axis, but they're ultimately really about the same thing, this deep, fantastical, mythological, I would say, engagement with the universe.
Let me ask you about another piece you recently published just this spring about what you call the Noematagraph.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, I was particularly enamored of this particular phrase that you came up with, neologism, because the Institute has a magazine that we call Noema. For people who don't know, a noema is a term from philosophy that refers to the object of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And you make this really provocative kind of analogy in this piece. Tell us, first of all, about the analogy between the cinematograph and the noematagraph. So the cinematograph obviously is the movies as we understand them. And then the noematagraph, you say, is the automation of a kind of thinking, in the same way that the cinema was a kind of automation of a certain kind of visuality. Tell us about that distinction, and then also how that has ramified into how you think about your own writing, your own creative process.
Yeah. So one of my persistent interest is this idea of technology as an artistic medium, right? We've had many new artistic mediums invented that are actually heavily technology mediated. So photography and cinema being prime examples. This is largely motivated by the whole AI boom that we're having now, right? So I think a lot of our current debates over AI in the arts tend to be focused on some very narrow, specific aspects. So the idea of, is AI going to displace human artists? All these models are trained on human artists' creations, but they're not being compensated. What should we do about that? I think these are very interesting and important ethical questions, and we should think about them. But because many other people have already thought about them, I don't find them to be particularly fruitful areas for myself to explore. I tend to explore areas that are not so explored right now. And it's fascinating to me to think about AI as a potential new artistic medium, in the same way that the camera was a new artistic medium. So that's what's motivating all this. And by the way, that's what my new book is about, right? My new book, All That We See or Seem, which is coming out in October, is basically a novel about the future of art in the age of AI. What does it look like to use AI as an artistic medium? Okay, so let me try to explore a little bit about what this actually means. So the analogy I use is to go back to the invention of cinema, right? In the earliest days of cinema, when the Lumiere brothers were showing the cinematograph, which is the first camera projector that can do moving pictures. The brothers actually did not think this was going to be a machine that would be useful for entertainment. They envisioned it as a scientific tool. You would take motion pictures and then study the pictures afterwards to understand motion, essentially. Cinema, kine, it's about movement. It's a machine that writes down movement. Right. Very beautiful neologism, actually. But it's that movement capturing that became key, right? So other people like Georges Méliès and all these wonderful other entertainers took the cinematograph and they said, let's imagine now that we can capture movement, what can we do with this thing? If you can capture movement, what are the stories you can tell, right? And it took decades of experimentation before the language of cinema was invented. And the full impact of the language of cinema would not be obvious to people until decades later. Because if you look at the first moving pictures, it's very unpromising as an artistic medium, right? The earliest motion pictures were only about 60 seconds long. They were hand cranked and they were silent. And people didn't really know what to do. I mean, it's just sort of, they set the camera there and had people move in front of it. That's basically it. What little dramatic narrative art they did involved basically silent pranks, things like that. And so if this is all you got to see, the idea that somehow this is going to become an artistic medium would be laughable to you. You would say, how is this useful? What is this? The most you can imagine is perhaps something like filming a play on the stage and then playing it for somebody else later. That's probably the extent of the possibilities here. But it took somebody like Georges Méliès to see that, wait. Now that you have this machine that can capture movement and you can splice movement around, you now have a tool that can break all kinds of rules about narrative art that used to be true, right? In the dramatic arts, it was just assumed that because you had to perform in front of an audience on the stage, that you had to follow certain unities to make your story comprehensible. The unity of action, of place, of time. You can't just randomly jump around. I mean, audiences wouldn't be able to follow you. But now that you have this motion capturing machine, you can in fact do that. That's why an actual movie is very different from a play, right? You can do the reaction shots, you can do the montages, you can do the cuts, you can do the swipes, you can do all sorts of things in the language of cinema. You can put audiences in perspectives that they normally can never be. So it's such a transformation of the understanding of presence, of how a subject can be present in a dramatic narrative story, that we now think of everything in a cinematic way.
The grammar of cinema has become a universal grammar for many other art forms.
Yes, and it's a heavily machine technology mediated art form. And my proposal here is that rather than thinking about AI as a cheap way to replace filmmakers, to replace writers, to replace artists, think of the machine AI model, whatever you want to call it, as a new kind of machine that captures something and plays back something. So what is the thing that they capture and play back? Well, the content of thought or subjectivity. That's what I argue. So the Noematagraph is basically my imagination of how the AI can be analogous to a cinematograph, but not for motion, but for thought, right? If you actually watch how people play and use AI for entertainment, a picture emerges that's very different from the picture that a lot of artists seem to fear, right? A lot of artists fear that in this terribly competitive world of art, now people would just buy bestsellers written by machines. They won't bother buying human-written novels. People will just watch movies made by AI. They won't watch human movies. I don't think that's actually a thing that I worry about. You can go on to YouTube for now, right, and find thousands of videos of people saying, here's how you can write a novel using AI. But you will find 0 videos that feature someone saying, here, I discovered this novel written by AI and I love it. And I want to talk about it with you. Yeah. 0. Right. So what does that mean? No, it doesn't mean that AI will never be able to write a novel. That's not my point. My point is that humans are far more interested in the process of working with AI to make something rather than the thing that's actually made. So it turns out that in every single instance where people said, I love working with AI, what they're really, really enjoying is the process of working with an artificial subjectivity. So it turns out that I think AI is really a subjectivity capturing machine, because by being trained on the products of human thinking, it has captured the subjectivities, the consciousnesses that were involved in the creation of those things. And now it's able to play them back following certain prompts. You can force the AI to take certain prompts. That's why role playing with AI is so fun. That's why so many people end up with AI boyfriends or whatever, right? Rather than looking at it as another malaise plaguing our society, we should look at it as people being playful. People are interested in subjectivities. And this is a machine that allows them to play with subjectivities and to craft their own fictions, to engage in their own narrative self-construction in the process of working with an AI. The fact that AI is sycophantic and shapeable by you is the point. It's not another human being. It's a simulation. It's a construction. It's a fictional thing. And people know that. That's what makes it fascinating, though. They can use AI to do things like explore a piece of art. You can ask the AI to explain, to interpret. You can role play with AI. You can explore a world that you construct together. You can also share these things with other humans. I mean, one of the great fun trends on the internet about involving using AI, in fact, is about people crafting their own versions of prompts with models and then sharing the results with other humans. And then a large group, a large community comes together to collaborative play with AI, if you will, right? So I think it's the playfulness, it's that interactivity that I think is going to be really, really determinative of the future of AI as an art form. As a medium for art, what will come out of it will look nothing like movies or novels or whatever. They're going to be much more like conversation with friends. They're going to be more like a meal you share with people. They are much more ephemeral in the moment. They're about the participation. They're about the consumer being also the creator. They're much more personalized. They're about this you looking into the strange mirror and sort of examining your own subjectivity.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I really love about the way you're framing this, Ken, is that one of the things that happens whenever you get a new form of expressive medium emerges is that the first thing that happens is people say, oh, I can use this form of expressive medium to do the things that already exist in kind of a new, in an automated way. So I can, as you said, like I'll take a play and put it on a screen. It's only over time that people realize the specific affordances of the new technology allows them to create totally new art forms, discursive forms, and new forms of sociability, right?
Yes.
I mean, the idea that everybody would sit in a room, like 1,000 people would sit in a room, stare at the wall with lights flashing on it would have been completely bizarre in 1850, right? And in fact, that was the dominant artistic medium of the 20th century, arguably, is that was the way people consumed it.
And it would have seemed dystopian to them.
Right.
It would have seemed dystopian. But now we sort of think of it, wow, it's actually a very social experience.
Right. So I think that there will be not just new artistic forms that emerge out of the collaboration between humans and LLMs or AIs in more broad sense. There'll be totally new sociabilities that emerge around these art forms.
Yes. I mean, that's already happening, right? I mean, one of the wonderful things is, a couple of years ago on Reddit, there was this trend going around of people prompting AI to create these comic strips of a day in the life of a typical blank nationality. And basically, these are very caricatured versions of people stealing the Mona Lisa from each other between different countries. And it just became this wonderful meme that everybody loved. There were, thousands of people participated to make these images, and they created the Mona Lisa multiverse, right? And it's really fun. But that's what, that's an early indication of what the potential of the medium is, that people are actually coming together in the social way to collaboratively craft a story with AI's help. And so anyway, I do a lot of speculation on this front. And I think about what is the possibility of AI as a way to get people to come together, to dream together, right? At some point, I think there's this whole idea of AI as a way to mediate the preferences of large numbers of people, but they can also mediate the artistic experience of large numbers of people. And I think that can be really interesting. That's one of the core speculations in All That We See or Seem, my next novel. This idea that AI can be, in fact, almost like a way to play a concert for an artist a dream maker to essentially get the whole audience to dream together collectively into one AI mediated dream. And I think it's, that's the part of playing with AI that people enjoy. And I think that is the potential for the new medium.
I mean, obviously, we're at a moment here in 2025 where we are on the cusp, at the very beginning of a revolutionary moment in technology across a variety of different spectrums, biotechnology. You spend a lot of time, I know, getting deep with technologists about what exactly is happening and what could be happening, and working with them to speculate about what these technologies could do.
Right.
Why is it important to you as part of your process to get really deep on the scientific, technological, and developmental particulars of these technologies?
So this may be sort of a minority perspective, right? But I think the two are actually basically manifestation of the same human impulse, right? I think what we're really all doing is to find the truth, not merely facts, right? The truth meaning, what is the deep meaning of any of this stuff? Because I practice as a technologist, my theory of technology is somewhat different from a lot of representations of technology in pop culture. I think we often speak about human technology as a thing that's alien to human nature. We think of technology as somehow deformed, some sort of impediment to our true expression of our human nature, right? But I don't think that's true. I think just like art, technology is in fact a very deep expression of our humanness. We are, very incredible as a species. We imagine things that have not existed before, and we make them exist. For billions of years, there were no such thing as airplanes, as far as we can tell. And then some humans imagined such a thing and then made it real. And now we have airplanes everywhere. And not just that, but within something like 6 decades, we went from the first powered flight to sending a human being to stand on the moon, right? This is pretty incredible that we dream these things and make them real. So what are technologists? They are also those who delve deep into the collective unconscious and uncover things and then make them manifest in this world. They just do it through technology, not art. What I find deeply fascinating about technology is that it is another way to access the collective unconscious, if you will, right? So when we explore LLMs, right, I think LLMs are deeply fascinating because there are so many ways to think about it. One way is to think that they're not quote unquote intelligent on their own. Rather, what they are is they're a way to realize the sort of semiotic theoretician view of language itself as a endless dictionary of definitions upon definitions upon definition with which you can converse. So it's like Roland Barthes, right? He talked about the jouissance of playing with language, of being a reader and a writer in this new mode where the words just come to you after references after reference. What he's actually describing is an LLM, right?
Right.
But that is not how he conceived of it. I mean,
he could
not.
Right.
But we have actually realized the Barthian, this incredible, playful, endless language embodied. That's what an LLM is. And to me, that's really wonderful, right? It's a way to, the LLM is the realization of that deep dream of the structural semiotic movement. But another way to think about it is, if now, as you read these papers by investigators, you're seeing that the way these large language models embody our linguistic understanding of the universe, our partition of the universe, and the way similar techniques are being used to solve problems like protein folding. We're realizing that there are deep parallels between the way our brains embody concepts like faces or vocabularies and the way neural networks embody faces. What seems to be emerging is this idea that there are some deep patterns in the universe that the LLM is sort of like allowing us to see, right? That to me is incredible. Like the fact that these techniques that are relatively simple mathematically are able to uncover patterns that we had only sort of envisioned latently in our brains that are now made manifest in this other creation of ours. I think it's a very eerie moment, right? It almost feels like the collective unconscious pushing forth in some way. I mean, this sounds a little woo, but I really do think there's something very important here that through technology, just like through art, we are doing something very similar. I mean, I've talked to a lot of scientists who sort of say that they feel what they're doing is very similar to what artists are doing. Just like artists are trying to dig out deep patterns, they are trying to dig out deep patterns. It's just that they use a different set of tools and they present what they say in different ways. But we are doing the same thing. We're trying to find these deep mythological patterns.
So your short story series, which was then made into a TV series, Pantheon, how is the work you did there manifest what you were just talking about?
Oh, so Pantheon is a series of stories exploring the notion of the singularity, not in the sense of, accelerating AI taking over all human cognition, more in the realm of uploading, right? Post-humanism. What does that mean to be a post-human, and how does that relate to being a human? I would say that those kind of questions occupied were my obsession really for something like 10 years. For 10 years, I was very interested in sort of thinking about what does it mean to have a consciousness, to be a human being. To what extent is it tied to the hardware of our bodies? Is it possible to actually carry that across into a different medium? But ultimately, what that's really about is this exploration of what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to engage with the universe in this way? Where I was trying to really figure out, again, these deep mythological concepts of the soul, really, if you will, right? This is a deep speculation that we've had. What is it about us, this sense of me? What is it really? Is it just tied to this? Can it persist? Does it go on? Does it have a separate existence from just the body? Is it, in fact, the manifestation of some deep pattern of nature in this temporary realm? And I think, again, now I'm still thinking about these same questions, but now I have a new tool to think about, which is the large number of these neural networks, these models that appear to do what humans can do cognitively without necessarily being quote unquote conscious. It's forcing me to think about this question from a different perspective, which is, we've always sort of said, I think, therefore I am. But is it possible to think without actually being? And LLMs do seem in some ways to represent this idea that you can think without necessarily be. And that's very strange. It's very odd. And it's very generative for me in terms of thinking about my own practice as a fiction writer.
The rocks have started to think. I mean, the silicon actually has the qualities of intelligence.
Right. It looks like they're thinking, right? Yeah.
So in the stories, the question that comes up is, can you upload a mind to a computer?
Right.
And the drama in the story, this is a slight spoiler, but the drama in the story is, are people willing to sort of give up their bodily life in order to have the power and perhaps infinite longevity that might come with the uploading process? So, I mean, that raises a whole series of metaphysical questions, which are, as you say, ancient. This must have been a thought experiment you did with yourself, which you then wanted to render into a dramatic form.
Right.
So talk about that process, tell the story about how you got to that thought experiment and then why the particular form that you chose. And I also want to talk then about the translation from the short stories into the visual medium.
In some ways, the question is actually very simple, right? Which is, if you think that, your sense of consciousness and your you, right? If you believe that you is not merely limited to this body, that is, if everything that is you is in fact material, right? That it is possible to sort of explain everything that creates you without resort to any sort of supernatural or even ideal explanations. Just it's material. Then it seems logical to say that we can replicate the material conditions of your existence in some other form, and then just have you continue on after this body has gone away, right? It seems intuitive to say that it is possible to do such a thing. If you can just replicate all the material conditions. But on the other hand, it seems very hard to accept the idea that somehow what you would create in that moment is just a copy of you, not you, or a simulation of you, not you. It's this, both intuitions exist for us, that a simulation is not the same thing as the real thing. That's an intuition we have. But also, if we are in fact material beings, then different material should be able to still instantiate us. These are both intuitions that we have. And so what my stories were trying to do is to sort of engage with this deep mythological anxiety that we have about who we are. Are we, if we could simulate ourselves, who's to say that this is not a simulation, right? These are all metaphysical questions that we sort of engage with. So my stories are about working out those anxieties in the form of tangible experiences. So this is another thing about my fiction practice that I think is important, which is I think it's important to deal with abstract things in concrete form, right? I think humans are particularly wired, in some sense, to work with stories. We don't do well with pure abstractions, at least not constantly. In fact, all of us encode our most cherished ideals in the form of stories, right? If you think about commitments to things like faith, democracy, freedom, whatever, these are not abstractions. You have a concrete representation in your head, a story, giving meaning to those things. I wanted to engage with these abstract questions, these metaphysical questions, but I had to sort of make them into a tangible form. A lot of my fiction is about taking what is otherwise merely abstract and metaphorical and making them concretely true. That's how fantasy and sci-fi works, right? So, for example, right, if I want to engage with the metaphysical idea, the metaphorical idea that love makes everything seem more alive, more colorful, then, the paper menagerie just literally makes that true. Love is what animates those paper animals and makes them come alive. Or another example will be if I want to engage with the metaphorical alienation that people feel in the modern world, then one way to do that would be to literally turn some human beings into androids and robots and sort of think about how can humans tell robots and humans apart? Can you tell a real human being apart from a robot? I mean, we're all living in that world now, right? But that was also the world for Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is fundamentally about the sense of alienation. That's what I was trying to do with those stories. I wrote these stories over a period of something like 15 years because I was struggling with this idea. And then I tried to tackle from every different perspective. I tackled it from the perspective of people who are waiting to be uploaded, people who refuse to be uploaded, people who were uploaded and now are questioning whether they really are who they thought they were, and people who were born entirely in the cloud and who have no sense of embodiment and who are trying to understand why embodiment is so important. And I think these are all interesting ways to engage with our own sense of who we are and what matters to us.
So as you were working out the set of ideas through these fictions, eventually it was turned into a successful TV show.
Yep.
Did you write it, as it were, translation ready, like thinking that this would turn into a TV show at all? And do you ever do that?
No, I don't ever do that. I think, again, right, I think...
Because there's definitely a lot of writing out there that's fictional form, but they're clearly looking for their TV, they're looking for their option.
You're right. It's a very interesting phenomenon where, because writing is often the least costly and the quote unquote easiest way to embody a story. A lot of people who are really trying to make TV shows would just embody their idea initially in some sort of a piece of fiction, right? So that the text is merely a step towards the ultimate expression of their vision. I'm not one of those people. I am very committed to the medium that I work with. So I chose fiction as the medium because text is both the most low resolution of mediums, but also the highest, right? It's low because it's it's just text. You can't do many of the things that you can do as a visual artist or as a filmmaker, but yet you can also do so much more, right? You can do things with text that are just not possible in other mediums. Text also demands way more from the reader than other mediums. And I think that has changed the way I think about fiction as a practice. As a filmmaker, you have a lot more control, I think, over how your audience reacts to what you put out there. As an author, you have much less, and you have to sort of work with that lack of control as a part of the medium. But in any case, when I wrote these stories, I intended them to be simply stories. Now, I did have in the back of my mind that someday I would turn them into a novel. I did think that as I was writing them, that eventually I would do something like, writers have done since time immemorial, which is to take a group of short stories they've written in the same universe and then see if you can craft a larger narrative around all of them. So I actually made some start towards that. I had an outline, I had some chapters drafted of the novel that would become Pantheon. But later on, when Craig Silverstein and AMC came along to sort of adapt the series, I got to work with him and the writers quite a bit. But I would say that I did not write these stories with the intention that they would be translated into this new medium. And I would say Pantheon is, in fact, a very new thing. It is based on the short stories, obviously, but it is its own thing. It has its own story to tell. And that was very cool to be part of that.
Now, you said in other interviews that you're despite working yourself as a translator, you're maybe a little bit difficult as a subject when your stuff gets translated.
Yes.
I guess there's always a loss of control anytime you release a text into the world, right? The readers will interpret it in ways that you probably don't always anticipate. I mean, I certainly have had that experience. I don't know what people's reaction is going to be to something I write until it goes out in the world. As it were, turned over the texts from the stories to the writer room for Pantheon, was there a little bit of anxiety about what they were going to do with it?
I think it's different. I've sort of spoken about this, as a translator in the narrow literary sense, right? I think what distinguishes my work from a lot of other people is that I don't care all that much about what is on the page, and what is on the page is not as controlling to me as a translator as what the intention of the writer was, right? This is actually a very different sort of approach than a lot of other people. A lot of people would take the approach that the text is paramount. Whatever's on the page is on the page. That's the only thing that matters. I don't quite agree. When the author is available and accessible, I think when you're doing a translation, what you're really trying to do is to help the author express what they meant to do in a new linguistic medium. It seems to me that you have to be able to access the author and ask them questions and to do your best to interpret their intentions sympathetically. That's what I always try to do. So certainly when I work with living authors, that's what I do. And I would argue that almost everybody who's translated living philosophers or thinkers, do something similar. You have to sort of, that language is very, very limited and in a lot of ways. And sometimes you have to sort of go to the author to understand their intention, to be able to do something that you feel honors their intention properly in the new medium. Now, when you're translating a dead author, it's a very different sort of practice because the intention is not available anymore, and you have to sort of do it with the text that you have. In terms of Pantheon, I was alive. I am alive. And so one of the great things about that process is that Craig Silverstein and his team, had me in the writer's room. So we discussed extensively my intentions, what I was trying to do. And I felt like I was able to contribute to the process in that manner. I could explain what I was thinking. What are the metaphysical issues that seemed interesting to me when I wrote this? And I can clarify in this debate, I don't actually have a side. I don't think one side is necessarily right versus the other side. I wanted to present their positions in the most sympathetic, plausible way. And I could clarify things like that. And I think that was important to me. So to me, once I got heard and that I knew that my input was used in the creation of the story, that makes me feel quite happy. I'm happy to be part of a much larger collaborative team to create something new. And that was wonderful.
And every act of translation ultimately is creating something new. I want to talk about something you recently translated, the Tao Te Ching.
Mm-hmm.
This has been translated and retranslated from Chinese, well, into many different languages, but we're talking about English here. One of the things I was looking at was your recent translation and comparing it to the translation that Ursula K. Le Guin, who's one of your heroes as a writer, has done. She, of course, didn't translate it exactly because she doesn't read Chinese. Why did you feel like we, the world, need a new translation of Tao Te Ching now?
Oh, I don't think the world needs anything. I think one of the great things about art is that it's not something that is needed, right? So one of the comments that we got from this retreat that I found particularly evocative is Mike Levin's point, which is something to the effect of consciousness. I'm not quoting him at all. I'm sort of paraphrasing, but the idea that consciousness involves doing what is neither prescribed nor forbidden, right? It's that space of playfulness. So it's not prescribed, not necessary at all, and yet it's not forbidden. It's just playful. I think art falls in that space. All art is in that space of not necessary at all, not prescribed, and certainly not forbidden. Well, people might try to forbid it, but we're going to art no matter what. And so I wanted to do another translation, not because I thought the world needed such a thing, but because I needed such a thing. And that was all I wanted. I did the translation of the Tao Te Ching at a time, it was in the middle of the pandemic, and it was very depressing. My entire practice has been about creating stories that engage in this very deep metaphysical way with our collective unconscious to reach the space of true spirituality, right? To figure out what it means to be human. And a lot of the stories I told ultimately were very hopeful. My fundamental belief is that we are miraculous creatures, that our existence, our consciousness is wonderful, and that a universe that can create us must have some meaning to it in a deep sense, that this is not in fact just quote unquote random, that all the stuff happened, and that we are in it. I mean, what is the point of having a universe full of wonders, of objective wonders, with no subjectivity to appreciate any of it, right? So my fundamental belief is very hopeful. But during the pandemic, if you recall, a lot of the collective stories that we were telling each other were the very opposite. It's paranoia, it's hate, it's hope, it's deeply destructive. It's the idea that everything in the world, in the universe, is horrible, and we must be suspicious of everyone. It's a very negative, zero-sum, non-creative, I would say the opposite of spiritual kind of stories. And it was very depressing to me. I was feeling that this entire act of storytelling, of narrative construction, is kind of hopeless, because here I am sitting in this universe watching my country fall apart and people falling into the trap of mass conspiracy narratives. Arguably, those narratives have continued and have still shaped our politics. It was deeply depressing. And so I wanted to engage with something that felt more eternal, more closer to what I wanted to do. So I was engaged with the Tao Te Ching, which is, a book I had not read in its original form before. The language that Lao Tzu wrote in is very different. This is something that I think people who don't have a sense of what classical Chinese is like don't really understand. Lao Tzu was writing essentially in what we would call Old Chinese, right? It's a different language. It's the predecessor of modern Sinitic languages, but it's very different. For one thing, Lao Tzu was writing in a language that had no tones, right? Students who study contemporary Chinese languages think that the tones are somehow essential to the language, but they're not. They are actually relatively recent, a Middle Chinese innovation, if you will. Old Chinese was essentially toneless, and it had a very, very interesting, different kind of grammatical construction, and even the way the characters that are still used often had different meanings. And so to understand the prosody of it and to sort of understand the poetry of it and to be able to pay attention to it in a deep way and to extract meaning from it was very fun for me. I felt like I was engaged with another consciousness from a long time ago that felt modern, right? I mean, I think that's one of the great things about engaging with the classics, which is how modern they actually often feel. Like oftentimes we emphasize how different an older piece of lit is. And I think I particularly despise this version of it, which is, when you're reading a classical piece of lit, people sort of insist on telling you that, it meant very differently to the audience to Homer's audience. Yeah, Homer audience would have interpreted this, and so on and so forth. This is all a lot of nonsense because one, you don't know. You cannot possibly know what the ancient interpretations are. You can only say what the extent surviving ancient interpretation, and that's just what they said. There's no way for you to know what the totality of the possible interpretations were. And two,
and there would have been many.
Yes. And two, all texts and all stories are self-translating. As if they survive this long, that means in the interim, they have been reinterpreted over and over again. And you cannot say those new interpretations are not part of the story, right? When it's sort of like, an example would be that if you're reading Romeo and Juliet now, it is not possible for you to not have the Bugs Bunny interpretation in mind. It is not possible that the Bugs Bunny rendition is in fact a part of the total text that is Romeo and Juliet. So in the same way that when you're reading the Tao Te Ching, it is not possible to keep everything in the thousands of years in between out of it. It's just not. But anyway, what often surprises me when reading the classics is just how modern they actually seem. Like ultimately, one of the things that I noted when I was doing my translation was I said Lao Tzu would actually do really well on social media. He has a trollish attitude about him. I mean, he was trolling the Confucians and the legalists all the time. So he would say these things that are deliberately provocative. Clearly, he does not literally believe them in their literal form. He meant them ironically, and you have to sort of interpret them that way. And yet, he is somebody who would just do that. I mean, Socrates did the same thing.
Nietzsche also would Nietzsche would have been great on Twitter.
Absolutely. They're trolls, but in the positive sense. In that chaotic, transgressive but helpful sense. And so I really enjoyed engaging with Lao Tzu and sort of seeing him and comparing him with Zhuangzi, another great Taoist philosopher. And one of the great things about the Taoists is that they are very funny. I think that's one of the things that, they do that the Confucians rarely do. The Confucians are also great writers, but they're all just way too serious. And they take themselves way too seriously, whereas the Taoists don't. And they're able to laugh at themselves and at the world. And that was immensely comforting to me to sort of come to this text and sort of to see the sense of freedom that Lao Tzu espoused and the sense of open interpretation. Lao Tzu had a lot of really wonderful things to say, right? I mean, one of the passages of the Tao Te Ching that really struck me was this idea that heaven and earth are not benevolent, right? His point is that to attribute human feelings to heaven and earth is deeply flawed. But the point isn't that the universe is hostile. It's more like the universe has its own pattern. We humans, however, care about one another, and we can also harm each other. And we have to sort of figure out, if the universe doesn't care about us, does that mean that we also shouldn't care about us? And the answer is clearly no. And if we do care about ourselves, how do we express that care? Do we make laws and do we tell other people what to do? Or do we try to fit ourselves into the pattern and try to do without doing? I think it's, really profound and interesting and very, very hopeful fundamentally.
So this raises the last question or topic I want to explore with you, Ken, which is this question of how humans treat each other is, in a sense, the question of politics and the question of governance. And one of the things that we at the Berggruen Institute internally have been having a big debate about is about what the kind of balance is going to be going forward between different modalities of doing governance. And just schematically, I think one way to think about it is traditionally we think of governance as being a product of laws, of things that are written down in black letter law. And we talk about that as legal code. But there's also another kind of code, which is increasingly governing more and more parts of our lives, which is computer code.
Right.
Right. And some people are very worried about that. They feel like, computer code is colonizing this space of governance that used to be, and this can be undemocratic because decisions are going to be taken away. Other people are hopeful about it because they say, oh, there's also these things that are broken in our current legal system. And maybe if we can just automate certain kinds of governance decisions, we don't need to actually have a vote on every single thing that gets decided. If we can have the traffic patterns be rearranged more effectively by computer code, we don't necessarily need to have a vote on whether we should turn the traffic lights on at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
We can figure out what the optimal thing is. So when you think about the future, especially given the rise of these super intelligences, the possible rises certainly of great intelligences, what do you think the balance is going to be? What do you think it will be, and what do you think it should be between more traditional black letter legal code and emerging forms of automation through digital code?
Well, this is a very complicated question, and there are a lot of parts of your question that we can sort of tackle separately. So let's start by sort of talking about the idea of law versus code, right? Which we often sort of think of as distinct things, but one of the things that's sort of happening is that they're evolving to be closer and closer to each other. The fact that, the rise of AI really is about having a universal linguistic interface on top of all formerly algorithmic kind of structures. It is now possible, a large part of what programming used to be about is to write essentially connecting bits of code to allow systems to talk to each other. That function now has largely been taken over by AI. You can, in fact, interface with all kinds of systems by talking with it, which is kind of incredible. But that suggests the possibility that we can, in fact, have a human language-based interface to automate a system to code, right? But that also means that law is going to be increasingly done in a way that requires machine assistance. So I'm now speculating a little bit, but I don't think I'm too far off. So one of the things that has happened to the practice of law is as technology has become more advanced, legal documents have also become longer and more complicated, right? So contracts used to be one page in the days of you actually had to physically write out these things. Once typing became a thing, contracts regularly blew up to be 20, 30 pages. And in the age of computer word processing, these contracts regularly are hundreds of pages long. I have no doubt that as drafting with AI becomes more prevalent, these documents will become thousands of pages long. And they will, in fact, be not interpretable by humans unless an AI goes and does the work for you. I have very little doubt that, as of now, legislators rarely read the entirety of the legislation. And in the future, they may, in fact, read it by reading an AI summary of it, if at all. And I would imagine that contracts in the future will be thrown back and forth with AI interpretation and AI drafting, and just the idea of machine augmented drafting. Of course, that's going to be a thing. Of course, and AI interpretation of it. Of course, that will be a thing. So code will become increasingly important, even to the interpretation of black letter law. Right. So I think that's almost inevitable. Now, am I hopeful? Am I not hopeful? I don't necessarily think in those terms. I think in terms of possibilities, right? So let's ask the question of what is the ultimate purpose of governance? Multiple possible answers. One answer is good governance essentially means a way to mediate the preferences of a large number of people who may not, in fact, all agree on the same things, but we have to figure out a way to mediate all of these people's preferences in a way that makes all of them feel heard, seen, and respected. It doesn't mean that they will get their way, but they have to feel heard and seen. I think that's the important thing about democracy that often gets neglected, right? Democracy in the cheap, thin sense is majority rule. But I guarantee you, none of us want to live in such a world. Tyranny of the majority is horrifying, right? Democracies that actually function are all fairly thick democracies, meaning that they're all entities that contain a whole bunch of structures that are meant to mediate and ameliorate the possible effects of tyranny of the majority. So rule of law rather than rule by law, if you will, right? Rule of law is this whole concept that there's a whole set of structures put in place to protect minorities, to allow them to feel that they are heard, that they're seen, that even if they lose, they're not going to be actually, turned into enemies of the state, etc., right? And it's not a surprise that, if you observe this moment in our own history, we are seeing some of those norms and protections being frayed, because there are increasingly people who are pushing for a very thin definition of democracy, of majority rule in its old sense, of let's push away all of these things. We can't agree, so let's just have the majority, however that's determined, decide everything, and minorities will have no rights. That's honestly, I don't think that's the version of the world we want to live in. So the question now becomes, can AI and technology and all of these things help in some way in this process of mediating between the preferences of a large number of people and figuring out how can we protect minority rights and allowing majority to feel that, in fact, they are able to carry out part of their vision and their will, because it does matter. A democracy cannot function if majority rule ultimately is not respected, and yet at the same time you cannot just have tyranny of the majority. My intuition is that LLMs and models and better AI systems that allow us to understand each other or to even feel each other, if you will ultimately have a positive effect on all of this. In the same way that so far we've seen the internet has had both a positive and a negative impact on the way our democratic discourse goes. I think AI will do something similar. I think there will be many positive things that come out of the AI revolution, the way that we understand each other, the way we can humanize each other, the way we sort of express ourselves and make our voices heard. It will also have lots of negative impact in the sense that whoever controls the models seems to have a disproportionate impact on the discourse. And then it's up to us to figure out how we want to prevent that. I don't know exactly how this will play out, but I just want to point out that AI is not going to be a solution to our problems, but it will be a piece of the machinery to allow us to construct better ways to aggregate preferences and to allow us to feel that we're heard and seen.
I think it's a great note to end on. Ken, thanks for coming on Futurology.
Thank you, Nils.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Berggruen, Nathan Gardels, Don Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardels, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Migliori, and Nick Goddard.